Black woman CEO denied withdrawal. Staff froze when she said, "I own this bank." The morning sun filtered through the tall glass windows of the bank lobby, casting long lines of light across the polished floor. It was a normal day for the employees behind the counters, their hands busy stamping documents, counting bills, and greeting customers with mechanical smiles. For most of them, this was just another Tuesday. They did not know that this ordinary day would soon turn into a story retold across news channels, blogs, and dinner tables for years to come. She walked in quietly, her presence commanding attention even before a word was spoken. She wore a red dress, bold but elegant, a choice that reflected both her confidence and her calm. Her heels clicked softly against the floor and her stride was unhurried. To some, she was just another customer. To others, especially those who looked closer, there was something about her posture and expression that spoke of authority. She was not there to beg for service. She was there because she belonged. Still, the whispers began almost immediately. A few staff members exchanged glances as she approached the main counter. One of them, a young teller barely 2 years into the job, leaned closer to his colleague and murmured, "Do you see her? She looks serious. Wonder what she wants." The woman stopped at the counter and handed over a slip. Her request was simple. She wanted to make a large withdrawal. Not unusual for a bank, but the number she wrote down made the teller's hand freeze. He glanced at the slip again as though his eyes were playing tricks. The figure was big enough to make him doubt whether it was real. He looked up at her with forced politeness. "One moment, ma'am. I'll need to check this with my manager." She nodded, her face calm, her arms crossed lightly in front of her. She did not explain, did not justify. She simply waited. The teller hurried to the glass office where the manager sat. The manager, a man in his 40s with a stiff tie and a louder voice, scanned the slip and his eyes narrowed. He glanced once at the woman standing patiently in line, then back at the paper. His face darkened. Within minutes, he stormed out of the office, holding the slip in one hand. The sound of his shoes against the tiles was sharp, each step echoing with anger. He stopped in front of her, holding the paper like evidence. "Are you serious?" he barked, his voice carrying across the lobby. Heads turned. Customers pulled out their phones. A hush fell over the crowd as the tension in the air thickened. "Yes," she answered simply. The manager scoffed. "Do you expect us to believe this? A withdrawal of this size? With this check? Do you think we are fools?" His words were loud, almost theatrical. The staff behind the counter shrank in their seats, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. The woman remained still. Her arms folded, her chin lifted slightly, her expression calm but firm. She did not raise her voice, nor did she look shaken. Her silence was unsettling, almost intimidating, though she said nothing. The manager continued, holding the slip up for everyone to see as if to shame her. "Fake checks again? You people think you can just walk in and take advantage of us? Not in my bank." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Customers whispered to each other, some already recording on their phones. Security guards in uniform stepped forward, their hands resting on their belts, watching carefully. Yet she stood her ground. She did not flinch, she did not argue, she did not even look away. Her eyes stayed fixed on the man shouting in her face, steady and unbroken. For a moment, the bank was divided. On one side was the loud, furious manager, confident in his accusations, eager to prove his authority. On the other side was the silent woman, a picture of composure, her strength radiating in a way that words could never capture. Minutes felt like hours. The silence she carried weighed heavier than his words. People in the room began to sense something unusual. This was not the reaction of someone caught in a lie. This was not the fear of someone exposed. This was the patience of someone who knew the truth would speak louder than accusations. A child tugged at his mother's sleeve and whispered, "Why isn't she scared?" The mother did not answer, but her eyes stayed locked on the woman in red, curious and unsettled. The manager, growing frustrated by her calmness, slammed the slip on the counter. "Tell me the truth right now before I call the authorities," he demanded. Still, she did not move. She simply folded her arms tighter, her gaze unwavering. The crowd, once eager to laugh at a scandal, began to quiet down. Doubt crept into their minds, not doubt about her, but about him. They wondered why, in the face of so much shouting, she had not broken. They wondered what kind of person could stand like that, unshaken with all eyes on her. Her silence became the question in the room. Who was this woman? And that doubt, the doubt not in her, but in the system that tried to shame her, was the seed of what would follow. The bank lobby had grown quieter after the manager's outburst, but the silence did not bring peace. It was the kind of silence that felt heavy, filled with judgment, filled with waiting eyes. People clutched their phones tighter, recording every second as if they were about to witness the fall of someone who had dared to demand more than she deserved. The manager paced in front of her, waving the slip of paper like a weapon, his voice dripping with accusation. He wanted her to confess, to stumble, to admit that she had no right to ask for what she had written down. But she did not move, and her stillness only made him angrier. "You think you can come in here and trick us?" he shouted, his voice sharp enough to cut through the air. "You think this is some game? I have seen this before. People trying to steal. People trying to cheat. And do you know where they end up? In handcuffs. You are not the first, and you will not be the last." His words echoed off the walls. A few customers shifted uncomfortably, some glancing at the woman in red with pity, others with suspicion. To them, the situation seemed clear, a confident man in charge exposing a liar. That was the story they had been trained to believe, and they repeated it to themselves as if it were already true. But deep down, even those who doubted her began to notice something strange. She was not panicking. She was not begging. She was not sweating or trembling. She stood with her arms crossed, her chin lifted, her eyes steady, as though she knew something the rest of the room did not. The security guards stepped closer. One of them, a tall officer with a stern face, placed his hand near his radio. "Do you want us to call this in, sir?" he asked the manager. The manager nodded eagerly. "Yes, get the police. This is fraud. I will not have this bank's reputation dragged through the mud because of one bold scam." A murmur spread across the room. Customers leaned closer, phones tilted, capturing the moment. Some smiled cruelly, waiting for her downfall, while others frowned, uneasy with how quickly judgment had been passed. But she remained calm. Her silence was louder than his anger, and though it unsettled him, he refused to show weakness. "Do you hear me?" he barked at her, leaning close. "You are finished here. No one walks in with fake checks and walks out free. You will regret this." For the first time she moved. She unfolded her arms and reached into her bag slowly, deliberately. The guards stiffened, their hands tightening, ready to act. The crowd held its breath. But she did not pull out anything threatening. Instead, she brought out another envelope and placed it gently on the counter. Her movements were calm, almost graceful, as if she was not under attack but simply correcting a mistake no one else understood. The manager snatched the envelope, tore it open, and pulled out the papers inside. His eyes ran across the lines, his mouth tightening. He frowned deeper with every word he read. He wanted to find evidence of fraud, but what he held was official, neatly stamped, and far too polished to be a clumsy fake. This does not prove anything," he muttered, but his voice had lost some of its strength. He waved the papers in frustration. "Anyone can make documents look real. That does not mean you are who you claim to be." The woman in red said nothing. She simply looked at him, her eyes calm but piercing. The silence stretched so long that people in the crowd began whispering again. "Why isn't she saying anything?" a man muttered. "She looks so confident," another whispered back. "Like she knows she's right." The manager, feeling the shift in the room, slammed the papers back on the counter. He turned to the guards, desperate to keep control. "Do not let her leave. She is lying. She is trying to fool us, and I will not allow it." The guards hesitated. They were trained to follow orders, but they were also trained to read people, and what they saw in her did not match the picture he was painting. There was no fear in her, no guilt, only a quiet strength that was hard to ignore. The tension thickened. The crowd waited, their cameras capturing every detail. The manager's face was red, his words growing sharper. But with every passing second, his authority seemed to shrink, while hers seemed to grow. Without shouting, without arguing, without lifting a finger, she was shifting the balance of power in the room. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was calm, measured, but it carried to every corner of the lobby. "You accuse me without proof," she said. "You humiliate me without cause. You think silence is weakness, but it is strength. And when the truth is revealed, you will understand the mistake you have made." Her words struck the room like a hammer. The crowd froze, hanging on each syllable. Even the guards looked at her differently now. The manager, however, only grew angrier. He slammed his fist on the counter and shouted, "Enough! I will end this right now." But though he shouted, his voice no longer carried the same weight. The more he accused, the more people looked at her instead of him. The more he tried to control the moment, the more control slipped from his grasp, and she stood there unwavering, letting his fury burn itself out. She knew something he did not. She knew that power does not always belong to the one who shouts the loudest. Sometimes it belongs to the one who waits, the one who believes, the one who lets the truth speak when the time is right. The crowd did not know it yet, but they were witnessing a turning point. The story was no longer about a woman accused. It was about a system being tested, and soon it would be about a revelation that would leave everyone speechless. The bank had turned into a theater where every person played a part without rehearsal. The customers stood in rows with their phones raised like an audience hungry for drama. The guards stood still as reluctant actors trapped between two leads, and the manager paced the floor, his loud voice filling the room as though volume alone could write the ending. And then there was her, the woman in red, silent yet powerful, standing as if the entire stage belonged to her. Minutes had passed since she spoke her first few words, but their echo still lingered in the minds of those who heard them. "You accuse me without proof. You humiliate me without cause." The sentence replayed itself, unsettling the confidence of the man who had shouted so hard to prove her wrong. He had expected her to fold, to argue, or to lash back, because that was what people usually did when cornered. But she was different. Her calmness made his fury look clumsy, like a child stamping his feet because the world would not bend to his will. The teller who had first handed the slip to the manager stood frozen, regret creeping into his young eyes. He remembered how politely she had written down the number, how she had waited without impatience, how nothing in her manner had hinted at deceit. Yet he had let doubt guide him. Doubt was the easiest road in a world that so often judged people not by their truth, but by how they looked, how they sounded, how they fit into an expected picture. And she had not fit his picture. Now the teller shifted in his place, wondering if he had been wrong. The manager, however, could not allow such thoughts. He fed on control, on the idea that his word was final inside these walls. He barked orders at the guards again, insisting they keep her surrounded. His tie loosened as sweat formed on his forehead. He looked less like a man in command and more like a man fighting to hold on to a rope slipping from his hands. "Do you all not see what is happening?" He cried out to the staff and customers alike. "This is fraud. This is criminal. She has no right to stand here and demand money that is not hers." But the more he spoke, the more the crowd's eyes turned back to her. They studied her face, her posture, her steady gaze, and they began to question. They were not experts in law or banking, but they knew what honesty looked like when they saw it, and she carried it without saying a word. She finally lifted her eyes toward the guards, and in that small gesture something shifted. The guards had been waiting for a reason to believe one side or the other, and for the first time, they felt the weight of their decision. One wrong step and they could be remembered not as protectors but as participants in humiliation. The taller guard cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "is there anything you would like to say for the record before we call this in?" The lobby grew quieter, the question hanging in the air like a test. Everyone leaned in. The cameras tilted forward. The woman in red unfolded her arms, her movements slow but deliberate as though she was in complete control of time itself. She placed her hands gently on the counter, looked at the guard, then at the crowd, and finally at the manager who was still red with anger. Her voice was soft but firm. "You treat me as if I am a stranger," she said, "but I am not a stranger here. I belong in this building more than most of you realize." The words rippled through the room. People frowned, confused but curious. The manager let out a harsh laugh, desperate to break the spell her words carried. "Belong here? That is rich. This is my bank to run, and you are nothing but a troublemaker wasting everyone's time." But the way she spoke had already planted doubt in minds. Customers whispered, "What does she mean by belong? Does she work here? Is she someone important?" The woman in red continued, undisturbed by his interruption. "You think silence is weakness? You think dignity is a mask for fear? But strength does not shout. Strength stands, and I stand here because this bank is mine." A gasp rolled across the crowd like a wave breaking against the shore. The words were too strong, too impossible to ignore. Phones caught every syllable, every movement, every flicker of reaction. The manager froze, his laughter caught in his throat. He blinked at her, shaking his head. "Yours?" he spat. "This is absurd. Do not play games with me." But the look in her eyes made his voice falter. There was no arrogance there, no joke, no bluff. There was only truth. And that truth, spoken without anger, hit harder than any shout he could muster. The guards hesitated, exchanging uneasy glances. One lowered his hand from his belt. Another stepped slightly back, unsure whether he was still protecting the right person. The customers erupted into murmurs, some gasping in disbelief, others smiling faintly as though they had just realized they were part of a story bigger than they had imagined. The manager, cornered now not by her but by his own crumbling certainty, waved the slip again. "If this is your bank, prove it." "Show me proof, because words mean nothing." Her lips curved into the faintest smile, not of mockery but of quiet assurance. She reached once more into her bag, pulled out another folder and laid it on the counter with care. The security guard reached for it before the manager could snatch it, his duty pulling him toward fairness. The guard opened the folder, his eyes scanning the documents inside. His brows furrowed, then lifted in surprise. He looked at her, then at the manager. "Sir," he said slowly, "these papers, this is ownership. Her name is on the registration. It is all official." The manager grabbed the papers, scanning them wildly, searching for flaws that did not exist. The stamps were real, the seals were intact, the signatures unmistakable. His lips parted, but no words came. His world, built on certainty and authority, cracked in that instant. The woman in red did not gloat, did not smirk. She simply stood, her silence once again more powerful than his rage. She did not need to scream that she had been right all along. The truth was there on paper, undeniable, unshakable. The crowd erupted with noise now, not of mockery but of awe. Some clapped, others whispered, others simply stared in stunned silence. The phones that had recorded her humiliation now recorded her triumph. The story had turned, and everyone knew they had witnessed a moment that would echo beyond those walls. The manager lowered the papers slowly, his hand trembling. He looked at her not with anger anymore, but with fear. Fear not of her power alone, but of the reflection of himself in this moment. Small, loud, and wrong. She looked at him once more and said softly, "Respect is not given because of a title. It is given because of truth. Remember that." And with those words, the balance in the room shifted forever. The lobby no longer felt like a bank. It felt like a courtroom, a stage, and a mirror all at once. Everyone who stood inside was not only watching her but also watching themselves, measuring their own judgments against the truth that had been laid bare. The woman in red had said only a few words, yet those words carried more weight than the manager's endless shouting. "This bank is mine." It was a statement so bold, so certain, that no one in the room could unhear it. The security guard who held the papers in his hand looked down at them again, as though making sure his eyes had not betrayed him. The seals were authentic, the signatures clear. He shifted uncomfortably, torn between loyalty to the manager who had barked orders and the evidence that sat heavy in his grip. Slowly he placed the folder back on the counter, closer to her than to the man who claimed authority. That simple gesture spoke louder than any announcement. It was respect. The crowd felt it too. Phones stayed raised, but the atmosphere had changed. Where before there had been laughter waiting to explode at her humiliation, now there was anticipation of something greater. People whispered words like owner, CEO, power. Strangers who had walked in for ordinary business now found themselves part of a moment that felt historic. They were witnesses to a truth that shattered assumptions and forced them to question the way they had looked at her when she first walked in. The manager, however, refused to surrender. His pride was wounded, and pride is often more dangerous than ignorance. His voice rose again, though it shook now with the weight of uncertainty. "These documents mean nothing," he insisted. "This is some elaborate trick. Do you all not see it? She has staged this. She wants us to believe her lies, but I will not be fooled." His words did not carry the same power anymore. They sounded defensive, desperate, like a man clinging to a rope that was already cut. The more he denied, the more he revealed his own weakness. The crowd's eyes no longer followed him. They followed her. She remained still, her silence heavy, her presence steady. She did not need to argue. She did not need to raise her voice. The truth had already been spoken, and truth does not rush. It waits, calm and patient, until the noise around it fades. A woman from the crowd finally stepped forward. She was an elderly customer who had been coming to the bank for years. Her voice was trembling but strong enough to be heard. "I know her," she said, pointing toward the woman in red. "I saw her picture once in a business magazine. She was listed among the most powerful women in this city. You mocked her because you did not know her, but I remember her name. She owns companies. She owns this bank." Gasps spread across the lobby again, followed by murmurs of agreement. People began searching their memories, some even typing into their phones, and within seconds, screens glowed with headlines, pictures, and proof. Articles confirming her status. Reports naming her as one of the leading CEOs in the financial world. The whispers grew louder. "She is real. She is telling the truth. She owns it." The manager's face drained of color. His lips trembled as he tried to maintain control. But the ground beneath him was already gone. The very customers he had once used as witnesses to her humiliation now looked at him with judgment. He had turned the room into a spectacle, but the spectacle had shifted its focus. He was no longer the accuser. He was the one exposed. The woman in red finally lifted her chin slightly, her voice calm but clear. "Truth does not need permission to exist. It simply is. And when you try to bury it, you only bury yourself." The weight of her words silenced the crowd again. Even those who doubted at first could not deny what they were seeing. A truth too solid to be broken. One of the guards, the one who had first asked whether to call the police, stepped back fully now. He folded his hands respectfully in front of him and gave her a small nod. It was a gesture subtle enough to go unnoticed by some, but powerful enough to shift the balance entirely. Respect had been given. The manager, sweating, adjusted his tie with shaking hands. He could not meet her eyes. He could not meet the eyes of the customers. For the first time since stepping out of his office, he looked small. His authority had shrunk into nothing more than noise. The teller who had started the chain of events lowered his gaze, shame coloring his cheeks. He remembered the quick decision he had made to doubt her, and it stung. He realized now that his doubt had not been about the check, but about her. He had assumed that someone like her could not possibly hold power so great. And in that assumption, he had been wrong. The woman in red did not address him, but her presence alone was enough to teach him a lesson he would carry for years. Never let prejudice blind you to possibility. A customer whispered. "She did not even need to shout." Another replied, "That is real power. Quiet, unshakable power." It was in that moment that the lobby transformed from a place of transaction to a place of revelation. People no longer saw her as a customer demanding money. They saw her as a figure of strength, someone who had turned humiliation into history. She took a slow breath and said softly, "I do not ask for respect. I command it, not because of who I am, but because of what I have built. This place stands because of me. Every wall, every counter, every desk you sit at, it all exists because I believed when no one else did." The room felt smaller with her words filling it. The walls themselves seemed to lean in, listening. The manager tried once more, his voice weak now like a man drowning. "You should have told us. You should have explained. How were we to know?" She turned to him, her expression steady. Respect is not given only when someone explains their worth. Respect should exist before you demand proof, because you never know who stands before you. Those words pierced through the air like truth carved in stone. They were not only for him, but for everyone who had doubted, for everyone who had whispered, for everyone who had looked at her and seen only what they wanted to see. The cameras captured her face as she said it, and in that instant, the story that would spread across the world was sealed. It was no longer about a withdrawal. It was about dignity. It was about a woman who carried truth without needing to scream it. And as she stood there, the bank itself seemed to bow, not in fear, but in recognition. The air inside the bank had changed. What began as an ordinary day of routine work had transformed into something unforgettable, a story that would ripple far beyond those glass walls. The woman in red stood calm, her truth planted firmly in the room while everyone else wrestled with what they had just witnessed. Customers whispered with wide eyes. The staff stood frozen, and even the guards seemed unsure whether they were still on duty or simply spectators in a lesson they had not expected to learn. The manager, once the loudest voice in the building, had shrunk into uneasy silence. He shuffled the papers in his hands, hoping they would reveal a flaw. a missing stamp, a sign that he could cling to as proof that he had been right all along. But there was nothing. Every seal was official, every line of text legitimate, every signature unshakable. The truth was printed clearly, and no amount of denial could erase it. She did not rush him. She did not pressure anyone. She allowed the silence to do the work for her. The longer the silence stretched, the heavier it became, pressing down on every person who had doubted her. Some shifted nervously in their shoes, realizing how quickly they had joined in the judgment without knowing anything about her. Others felt ashamed for the smirks they had shared when the manager first accused her. And then something remarkable happened. One of the younger employees behind the counter, a woman in her 20s with nervous hands and a timid voice, spoke up. Her voice trembled at first, but she forced herself to be heard. I've seen her before, she said, looking directly at the woman in red. I was at a seminar last year. She was one of the keynote speakers. She spoke about building businesses from the ground up, about leadership, about creating opportunities where none existed. Everyone in that room stood and clapped for her. I remember because I thought to myself, this is the kind of woman I want to become one day. The room stirred with her words. The younger teller's honesty added weight to what was already undeniable. Customers leaned in, whispering again, but this time not in mockery, this time in awe. The story was writing itself in real time, and the hero stood right in front of them. The woman in red turned her head gently toward the young teller and gave her the faintest nod. It was not a nod of pride or superiority. It was a nod of recognition, of encouragement, of silent mentorship. The kind of nod that said, yes, I see you, and yes, you can be more than what this world expects of you. The manager, his pride bleeding out with every passing second, slammed the papers back onto the counter. His hands shook, his tie hung loose, his words stumbled. This changes nothing, he muttered, but even he did not believe it. His voice lacked power now, carrying only the thin edge of denial. One of the guards finally stepped away from his post, his arms no longer crossed in suspicion but lowered in quiet respect. He looked directly at her and said, "Ma'am, I believe you. I can see now this is your place." The manager spun toward him angrily. "What are you saying?" "You are supposed to protect this bank." The guard replied evenly, "And I am. By protecting the truth." The crowd erupted again with murmurs. Some clapped softly as if witnessing a verdict being read. Others smiled in relief as though justice had finally found its way into the room. The woman in red did not smile, though her calmness deepened. She placed one hand gently on the counter, her posture graceful yet unshakable. "It is not about proving myself," she said, her voice steady. "It is about reminding you all of something simple. Respect should never be given only after proof. It should exist before, because you never know who stands before you, or what they have built to reach this moment." The words hung in the air like stone, unmovable and undeniable. People recorded them, already knowing those lines would be replayed countless times across screens far beyond this building. They would be quoted in articles, written in posts, repeated in speeches. It was not just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had ever walked into a room and been doubted before they were seen. The teller who had first doubted her, the one who had carried the slip nervously to the manager, swallowed hard. His voice cracked as he spoke. I am sorry," he whispered, though only those closest to him heard. "I should not have assumed." She turned her gaze toward him, and for the first time her expression softened. "Do better next time," she said simply. "Not for me, but for yourself. Doubt is heavy, it blinds. Free yourself from it." Those words pierced deeper than anger ever could. The young teller nodded quickly, tears pricking at his eyes. He knew this moment would stay with him for the rest of his life. The manager, however, still could not let go. Pride is a cage, and he was trapped in it. His voice shook as he barked one last desperate order to the staff. "Ignore her. She's lying. None of this is real." But no one moved. The staff stared at him with disbelief. The guards looked away, and the customers openly shook their heads. His voice was no longer authority. It was noise. The woman in red looked at him for a long moment, not with anger but with something colder, pity. She spoke again, her voice calm, unwavering. "You tried to humiliate me, but you have only humiliated yourself. You wanted to expose a fraud, but you have exposed your prejudice, and now everyone here has seen it." The silence that followed was heavier than any shout. The cameras recorded his face, pale and defeated. The weight of his own actions pressed down on him harder than any punishment the law could bring. She turned then, slowly, her heels clicking softly on the polished floor, as she began to walk toward the exit. The crowd parted for her without hesitation, as though the very air cleared a path for her presence. Every step was a lesson, every movement a message. As she reached the door, she stopped and turned once more, her voice carrying across the lobby. Remember this day, not because I own this bank, but because dignity cannot be denied. It waits, it endures. And when the truth comes, it changes everything. With that, she walked out, leaving behind a room that would never forget her. Outside the glass doors of the bank, the world was moving as usual, cars rolling by, pedestrians walking with their eyes on their phones, the sun painting the streets in a golden light. But inside the bank, time felt like it had stopped. Every person who remained in the lobby carried the weight of what had just unfolded. The woman in red had left the building, but her presence still lingered in the air like a fragrance that refused to fade. People lowered their phones slowly, realizing they had captured something far more powerful than a simple argument in a bank. They had recorded a revelation, a moment of dignity rising above doubt. The clips would soon spread, but even before they did, the witnesses knew that they themselves had been changed. The young teller sat at his counter, staring at the spot where she had stood. His mind replayed the moment when he had doubted her, how easily he had believed the worst instead of considering the possibility of greatness. He felt small, but not because she had made him feel small. It was his own reflection in the mirror of her strength that humbled him. He whispered under his breath, "I will never make that mistake again." The elderly customer, the one who had spoken up about seeing her in a magazine, wiped her eyes gently. She had lived long enough to see many things, but few moments had struck her like this. She thought about all the times she herself had been underestimated, dismissed because of her age, ignored because of her quietness. And now, seeing this woman rise with such calm power, she felt something stir within her, a reminder that dignity has no expiration date. The guards exchanged glances. Their uniforms were meant to give them authority, but even they understood now that real authority did not come from badges or belts. Real authority came from truth. One of them finally broke the silence. "She carried herself like a queen," he said softly. His partner nodded, not like someone trying to prove power, like someone who already had it long before we noticed. The manager remained behind his counter, his pride shattered. His face was pale, his hands restless as they fiddled with papers that no longer mattered. He knew the cameras had captured him. Every word, every accusation, every ounce of arrogance. He could already imagine how the footage would spread, how his face would become the symbol of ignorance, how his words would be repeated not as commands but as mistakes. He lowered his head into his hands, feeling the crushing weight of consequences that were only beginning. Meanwhile, outside, the woman in red walked down the steps of the bank, her stride unbroken, her chin still high. Passers-by glanced at her, unaware of the storm she had just left behind. To them, she was simply a confident woman walking with purpose. But to those inside, she was something far greater, a lesson in silence, strength, and truth. Her car waited at the curb. The driver, a quiet man in a dark suit, opened the door for her. He had seen her walk out of countless buildings, but he noticed something different in her eyes this time. They carried a weight, but not the weight of defeat. It was the weight of victory, the kind that does not need to be shouted or celebrated with noise. Victory that simply exists undeniable. As she sat inside the car, her phone buzzed with messages. She ignored them for the moment, choosing instead to close her eyes and take a slow breath. She did not need the validation of headlines or comments. She knew who she was. She knew what she had built. The noise of the world could wait. Back inside, conversations sparked like fire. Customers gathered in small groups, retelling what they had just seen as if trying to convince themselves it had truly happened. One woman whispered, "She owns the bank. Can you believe it?" "She actually owns it," another replied. The manager looked so sure, but she never needed to shout. That's what stayed with me, her calmness. The young teller, still at his station, opened his browser discreetly. He typed her name into the search bar, and within seconds, dozens of results appeared. Articles about her rise from humble beginnings, interviews where she spoke about perseverance, stories of companies she had rescued from collapse. He scrolled through them, his chest tightening with awe. She was not just a CEO. She was a story of resilience written in flesh and blood. He leaned back in his chair, whispering again to himself. I saw her. I actually saw her. For him, it was more than an encounter with a powerful woman. It was a reminder that greatness could stand in front of you when you least expect it. The manager finally lifted his head, his pride broken but his mind racing. He realized he had not just disrespected a customer. He had disrespected the very owner of the institution that paid his salary. And worse, he had done it publicly. He imagined the calls he would receive, the meetings that awaited him, the explanations he would have to give. Shame burned his skin, but beneath it was fear. Fear that this moment would mark the end of his career. And yet the lesson was clear. Respect should never come after proof. It should exist before judgment. He had failed to understand that, and now the entire world would see his failure. The woman in red's words echoed in the minds of everyone who had heard them. Respect is not given only when someone explains their worth. Respect should exist before, because you never know who stands before you. That line repeated itself across the lobby, unspoken but remembered. It was no longer her truth alone. It had become their truth, a line etched into their memory. Far away from the bank, as her car drove smoothly down the road, she finally opened her phone. Messages flooded in from colleagues, from friends, from journalists already hungry for a quote. She scrolled through them with steady eyes, her calmness unbroken. One message caught her attention, a simple line from an old mentor. They tried to question your worth. You reminded them you never needed their permission to be who you are. She smiled faintly, closed her phone, and leaned back against the seat. The city passed by her window, unaware that its ordinary streets carried the footsteps of a story that would inspire thousands. Inside the bank, the employees slowly returned to their tasks, but nothing felt ordinary anymore. The teller worked with trembling hands, each stamp and signature reminding him of the mistake he had made. The guards stood straighter, their eyes sharper as though determined to never misjudge so quickly again. The customers walked out whispering, eager to tell the world what they had witnessed. And the manager? He remained at his desk, staring at the empty doorway where she had stood. For the first time, he realized that authority is fragile, that shouting does not equal power, that judgment without knowledge is the quickest way to lose respect. He sat there silent, a man humbled not by punishment but by truth. The story was no longer hers alone. It belonged now to everyone who had seen it, everyone who had recorded it, everyone who would hear it. It was a story about dignity, about strength, about the quiet but unshakable truth that cannot be denied. And though she had left the building, her presence remained, teaching them all long after her heels had clicked across the polished floor for the last time. The following days turned the quiet incident inside the bank into a storm that reached far beyond its walls. The customers who had recorded the scene uploaded their videos, and within hours, millions of eyes had watched the calm woman in red declare the words that froze a room. This bank is mine. What had begun as whispers inside a single branch became headlines across news outlets, captions across social media, and conversations in offices, schools, and homes. The image of her standing tall while the manager shouted became a symbol that people carried into their own lives. The footage spread quickly, not because it was dramatic in the way arguments usually are, but because it revealed something deeper. It showed the contrast between noise and dignity, between prejudice and truth, between a voice raised in anger and a presence unshaken in silence. People replayed the clip not to laugh but to learn. They saw in her a reflection of their own struggles, the moments when they had been doubted, dismissed, or treated as less than they were. Her calmness became their courage, her strength became their reminder. Inside the bank, change began quietly. Employees who had stood frozen that day spoke to each other in hushed tones, admitting their mistakes. The young teller confessed to his colleagues that he had been too quick to doubt, too quick to believe that her request was impossible. His honesty spread, and others followed, acknowledging that they too had judged her before giving her a chance. The shame they felt was heavy, but with it came growth. They promised themselves silently that they would never again let their assumptions guide their respect. The manager, however, carried a heavier burden. His voice had been the loudest in the room, his accusations the sharpest. Now his face was everywhere, not as a man of authority but as the image of arrogance undone. He sat in his office with the blinds closed, drowning in calls from higher executives demanding explanations. Each call reminded him that the woman he had tried to humiliate was not just a customer, but the very CEO of the institution he served. His pride had blinded him, and the whole world had seen it. Meanwhile, the woman in red continued her life without fanfare. She did not chase the headlines, did not seek interviews, did not issue statements. She allowed the story to speak for itself because she understood that true dignity does not need to be defended or decorated. It stands on its own. She returned to her work, to meetings, to decisions, to building futures for people who trusted her vision. But wherever she went, the echo of that day followed her. People looked at her not only as a leader of business, but as a leader of strength. In schools, teachers played the clip to their students telling them, "This is what it means to know your worth." In offices, workers whispered to one another before meetings, reminding each other to stand tall like the woman in red. In homes, parents showed the video to their children saying, "Never let anyone make you feel small when you know who you are." The story lived not only in the footage but in the lessons people carried from it. Lessons about patience, about truth, about the quiet power of believing in oneself even when surrounded by doubt. One evening, weeks after the incident, the young teller sat at his desk long after the bank had closed. He replayed the moment again in his mind. Her calm eyes, her steady voice, the way she had looked at him when he whispered his apology. That moment had changed him. He picked up a notebook and began to write. He wrote not about banking procedures or customer records, but about what he had learned. That every person who walks through the door deserves respect, no matter how unusual their request, no matter how unlikely their appearance. He wrote as though he were reminding his future self never to forget the day he stood face to face with truth. The manager, in contrast, struggled. He avoided eye contact with customers, kept his voice low, and lived in fear of every headline. Yet even in his shame, he began to learn. Slowly, he realized that authority is not power if it lacks humility. He realized that respect given too late is no respect at all. His fall was painful, but even in his fall there was a lesson, that arrogance has no place where truth lives. As for the woman in red, she remained what she had always been, steady, grounded, unshakable. She did not seek revenge against those who doubted her, nor did she punish the ones who had tried to humiliate her. Instead, she turned her energy toward building more, creating opportunities, and lifting others. She knew that the best answer to doubt is not anger, but proof. And the best proof is not a document, but a legacy. Months later, when asked in a rare interview about the incident, she answered with the same calm she had carried that day. "People will doubt you," she said. "Sometimes because of who you are, sometimes because of what they cannot imagine for themselves. Do not waste your strength on their noise. Save your strength for your truth. When the moment comes, your truth will speak louder than their doubts." Those words became as famous as the clip itself. They were written in articles, quoted in speeches, and remembered by those who had once felt small. She had not only defended herself that day, she had given the world a reminder of dignity. The bank eventually returned to normal business, but its walls remembered. Every desk, every counter, every polished floor carried the memory of the day silence triumphed over noise. Employees walked with straighter backs, customers felt a quiet respect in the air, and even the guards stood differently, as though they now understood the deeper meaning of their role. The story of the woman in red became more than a viral clip. It became a parable, a story told not just for entertainment but for inspiration. People spoke of it when they doubted themselves, when they faced prejudice, when they felt unseen. They whispered her words to themselves, reminding their hearts that truth does not shout. It simply waits. And somewhere in her office, high above the city, the woman in red looked out of her window at the streets below. She saw people rushing to work, cars moving in lines, lights changing at every corner. To the world, she was a CEO, an owner, a figure of power. But to herself, she was simply someone who had walked a hard road, who had faced walls of doubt, who had built her place brick by brick. She smiled faintly, knowing that the story told in that bank was never just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been underestimated. Her phone buzzed with another message, this one from a stranger. It read simply, "Thank you. Because of you, I stood taller today." She placed the phone down, her smile lingering. That was enough. For she knew that true power is not in the money withdrawn nor in the titles printed, but in the quiet ability to inspire others to see their own worth. And on that day in that bank, she had done exactly that.